All right, so we're now live and people are coming in. Welcome, everyone.
I was going to say, it's great to see everybody coming in.
Everybody streams in, yeah, it's pretty cool.
My favorite part of a Zoom meeting.
Yeah.
All right, so as y'all are coming in, you can just say a little hello to our facilitator. I say, do you go by Reverend Paul?
Reverend Paul.
Padre Paul, Bishop Mary, and Bishop Deon. So far, we have about 170 people.
Excellent. I'm going to see how the stream of attendees goes before I jump into welcoming everybody officially. So we'll give it a couple of minutes and then we can get going.
And as everybody is coming in and saying hello, make sure that you are sending out your message to all panelists and attendees. So up at the top of your little message, you'll see a little blue box. And so make sure you click the drop down button. And so then that way you can send it out to all panelists and attendees. So then that way the panelists aren't just seeing your lovely messages of hello.
Well, I love this. It's like a family reunion, except
virtual.
And I'm not related to everybody. And less history.
I think there are less fights that way.
Right.
I'm seeing North Carolina, Alaska, California, Spokane, Atlanta, Oklahoma, Connecticut, Iowa, Oregon. There was a London, Diocese of Bethlehem. I say Idaho. Say, I think Deon, you have one of your one of your seminarians in. So you can check attendance.
I saw Brighton, Michigan. Hi, Susan.
I say Long Island. I think I saw an El Camino Real for you, Mary.
Good, cool. Who is it? Does it have a name?
That was well past in the scroll.
Right.
It's a really fast read scroll.
It is. I'm getting a little bit busy reading.
Now we're up to 200 people who are on.
Oh, great. Okay. What do you think, Sarah?
Let's get rolling.
All right. Welcome to this gathering on liturgical formation. My name is Paul Fromberg, and I am the chair of the Standing Commission on Liturgy and Music. More than 400 people from across the Episcopal Church have registered for this conversation about liturgy, sharing current initiatives of the SCLM and the Task Force for Liturgical and Prayer Book Revision, all of which is in preparation for the 80th General Convention. We also intend to speak to liturgical anxieties in the wider church and hopefully to produce fruitful conversations across the church. We also hope to provide resources for cultural competence when it comes to planning liturgy. I want to give you a little bit of an idea of how these days are going to go. The first 2 days of the gathering will feature 2 segments, each with 2 speakers. The speakers we have invited are scholars and practitioners, and mostly just people who love the liturgy. Each session will end with a time for questions, which you can submit in the Q&A function on Zoom, which Sarah can explain in more detail. And then the third day will be for diocesan representatives only, who will be participating in small group conversations and are tasked by their diocese with sharing the insights of this gathering with members of the diocese. Before we begin, I would like to thank the SCLM Formation Subcommittee members who have organized this gathering, Thomas Alexander and Ellen Johnston, and our technical host, Sarah Stone-Cipher-Boylan. And the gathering is co-sponsored by the SCLM, by Lifelong Learning at Virginia Theological Seminary, and Church Publishing. Sarah, do you want to talk a little bit about how to do the Q&A function, which we'll be addressing at the end of our session?
Certainly. So you can see that we'll have a very active chat, but in order for Reverend Paul to be able to see your questions, we are going to be using the Q&A button, which is down below at the bottom of your screen. And it looks like there are two little chat bubbles right next to each other. And when you use that, it just streamlines this experience significantly for us on the other end.
And those questions will be Ellen and Thomas are going to be helping with those questions. So if we don't answer your question, it may be because the same question was asked by somebody first or something like that.
We're going to do some curation of questions.
Curation of questions, indeed. Our first plenary is asking the sort of fundamental question, what is liturgy for? And our two speakers are the Right Reverend Mary Gray-Reeves. Mary is the Bishop Resigned of the Diocese of El Camino Real and is the co-author of the 2011 book, The Hospitality of God. She's currently the managing director of the College of Bishops, a community of formation and education for newly consecrated, active, and retired bishops. Our other speaker is the Right Reverend Deon Johnson. Deon is the Bishop of Missouri, ordained, consecrated, and installed this past June, a veteran Episcopal priest with deep experience in social justice issues and ministry to the LGBTQ plus communities. He has served in many positions in the wider church and the community, including as a member of the task force on liturgical and prayer book revision. Mary and Deon, let's start with the very first question. What is liturgy for?
Deon, you want me to go first? I'll go first this time. We've already told you what you're going first on some other things. It's a great question. I really enjoyed pondering the question because there's a lot of things to think about, like what point in history are we answering this question? And I think everybody in the room should ask the question of themselves. You know, what is it for me? What is it for my context? Because those things all factor in. But my single sentence answer was to be of service in the coming of the kingdom. And as I pondered that this morning, I remembered, I think it's Karl Barth who said, Jesus prayed for the kingdom and he got the church. And which is a great comment about reflecting that we get conflicted about what is everything in the church for.
Thank you.
Yeah. I would add to that, and thank you, Mary. I would add to that liturgy is where we begin our mission and ministry. When we gather on Sundays, either virtually or in person these days, our worship spins off our mission and our ministry into the world. It's kind of like the adrenaline boost to go out and do the work of following Jesus.
Thank you. Mary, you wrote The Hospitality of God in 2011, right?
Yes, published in 2011. Mm-hmm.
And in the book you write, the heart for mission, the heart for reconciliation, the ability to listen and live in the wider culture and convey back to the institution are central to our Anglican understanding of ministry and mission, whether at home or abroad. Liturgy and mission go hand in our tradition. How do you understand the connection between mission and liturgy?
Well, first I want to say also Michael Parham, Bishop Michael Parham, who was Bishop of Gloucester at that time, he and I co-wrote the book. He passed away in 2016. And he was, he was an official liturgist. I'm a practitioner and kind of a hack or a scrappy at this work. But I think for me, to Deon's, to spin off his point, those are never connected. The words of Scripture, the actions of the liturgy are all about living the fuller life of being the presence of Christ in the world, of living as followers of Jesus in the world. So they're never detached. Certainly, it's something we saw in the what I still use the language emerging communities. And I would encourage us not to get too solid on language when we're talking about mission, because it should be fluid and dynamic. We should not fix it. with words that we think we understand fully the definition. But I think the synergism between the acts of worship and our acts in the world are absolutely linked in our theology as Anglicans. Our incarnational theology is very clear, as God is present in the gritty, earthy stuff of life, and that includes the really nice bits and the really awful parts of it.
I wonder if in the 9 years or so since the book was published, have there been any changes or any developments in the way that mission and liturgy engage each other?
Well, I think it's a bit more rigorous these days. Having been served as bishop in a diocese in California, the homeless issues there, for example, you can't avoid it, you know. So if we think this is not part of our daily existence as Christians, when we read the Gospels and we walk around the streets of San Francisco, for example, or San Jose, where I was, you know, it's just unavoidable. It's in our faces in a way that it cannot be avoided. I think in terms of the last 4 years as well, with the anxiety in our country on all kinds of levels right now with COVID, our accelerated learning around white supremacy and privilege and racial justice, it's just readily apparent. So how we engage with that real content on a Sunday morning in worship and how we engage with it in our daily real lives is what it means to be Christian. I'm not sure that answers your question, but.
Oh, this is a more freewheeling conversation than answering my questions. I wonder, Deon, if you have experience in the relationship of mission and liturgy, or a stance or a position or an idea or a thought or.
I have some thoughts. Well, I mean, I think it was James that said our faith without works is dead. I mean, I think liturgy without action is dead. You know, we can have the most glorious liturgies, but if we're not engaging in our community, if we're not engaging with the folks that are presenting themselves as Christ to us, we're missing the whole point of our liturgy. We're missing the point of our worship. I mean, that would be the short answer.
There's a way in which mission and liturgy are inextricably linked. You can't have one without the other. And we find ourselves today in a time of pandemic, a time of social unrest. The challenges are huge. Deon, you were quoted last month in an article entitled "Envisioning Liturgy for a Post-Pandemic Church," quoted in the Living Church saying, "We are at a time in the life of the church when we're going to have to experiment with some liturgical innovation and see what makes sense going forward." What is your hope for liturgical experimentation as we live in this difficult time of social unrest and pandemic, as well as the larger conversation about prayer book and liturgy revision?
Well, I think we're going to have to put all of this in a bit of perspective. This pandemic will come to an end. And on the grand scheme or in the grand life of the church, this is going to be a blip. The temptation is to try to create all kinds of stuff for our current situation, when the reality is, you know, we're going to have to figure out what the church looks like in its next normal. We're going to have to figure out, I mean, if you read the 2019 parochial report, we're going to have to figure out how we're going to respond to that. And it's not going to be in the midst of a pandemic. We're not going to be in this thing forever. So we have to, I think, take the long view when it comes to liturgy. Same thing when it comes to prayer book revision. The temptation is to, you know, bake parts of this pandemic into what another prayer book or our liturgical life going forward is going to look like. And to me, we can't do that. We're going to learn some things from this pandemic. And I honestly think that for the church, this pandemic is a time of fermentation, that we get to really look and recognize faith formation, for instance, is really needed. Understanding our liturgy is really needed at this time. So all those things that we've been talking about and writing papers about and having arguments on Facebook about, now we actually get to get on with the business of actually doing those things as we approach what the next normal for the church is going to look like.
What kinds of experimentation do you see, Deon and Mary, for that matter, both of y'all? What kind of experimentation do you see that really excites you, that lifts your heart up? How do you see people in this time responding liturgically to God's mission in the world?
Well, I mean, I have to say that before I even begin to answer the question, I have to say that I am so tremendously proud of the clergy across the board who have managed to go from, folks sitting in a pew on a Sunday morning to figuring out how to do Zoom and live streaming and how do you engage people from distance and all that stuff. I mean, the level of innovation and creativity is astounding. So I have to begin by just lifting that up. And there's some really great things that are happening out there. For instance, I've seen one community that is trying to figure out, how do we engage with people who generally don't read? The Episcopal Church is, for better or for worse, an educated community. The fear that I have, and I suspect that some of our clergy and our sibling bishops are having, is that we're going to end up being a church for the middle class, the college-educated folks. What do we do with the homeless poor? What do we do with folks who don't have an education, who handing them a book of common prayer and saying, hey, turn to page 355 is just not going to work? And so I'm seeing some places where, for instance, they're looking at how do we adapt our liturgy for communities that aren't from the middle class, who aren't from the suburbs, predominantly white. I mean, it gets us into, and I know we're going to talk about it, it gets us into even our language. What does our language say about who we are and who our church is able to reach?
Mm-hmm. Mary, a question to you. Are you seeing signs of life in people's experimentation in the liturgy?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think, I mean, I'm not a diocesan bishop any longer, so I'm a step back, but I hear diocesan bishops. So I too want to commend our clergy on the ground who are trying to make this work. And I think a couple of things. One is from the last question, mindful that in El Camino, we actually required all our postulants, deacon and priest to do community organizing. They couldn't get ordained without it. So they had to do their CPE and that. And to remember, we are not chaplains. We do chaplaincy work, but we actually have to be engaged in the community so that we're truly listening to what's happening in our neighborhoods. And we know how to craft mission and ministry. We know what's going on out there, what the real concerns are and the challenges are. And so I think liturgy can get formed out of that, and liturgies can be created out of that as in real time in terms of what's actually happening, real live time in the neighborhood. So I imagine that, and I know certainly for emerging leaders, missional leaders, that is their prime concerns, to be paying attention to the communities that are not, the church is not paying any attention to or isn't interested in for whatever reason. And is in conversation with them. And so they're in response to that. There was a great video that a congregation in Virginia put out about, it was like a 20 person on a Sunday congregation. And when COVID hit, they started doing some streaming, but they started going outside and wandering around the rural area of their community and started meeting people. And I think their congregation like doubled, so as we connect with people, that's where the opportunities are going to be. I'd say one more thing about this time is that, for me, the question right now is, what is the missional future of the church? And so the missional future will have something to say about how we craft liturgy, or in my opinion, it should have something to say about how we craft liturgy. And to Deon's point about reaching communities that do not work in 800-page books. and that don't, the daily office in terms of its bulk, for example, makes zero sense to a technological person, right? And who deals in sound bites. So all of those are cultural realities that are not, that I think can be played with and not mess with core theology, you know, and so we need to have conversations about that. What is cultural in our tradition, and what is core value theology non-negotiable? And I think there's a lot more negotiable than we take the time to have the conversation to discern. And I recognize those are difficult conversations because our Anglican heritage, how we experience it, is near and dear to us. And it will require us to be sacrificial as we move into a missional future.
Right. What I would add to that, I mean, for instance, looking at what's happening, or some of what's the experimentation that's happening in the Diocese of Atlanta around Imagine Church, that, I mean, it is very Anglican if you look at the layout of it, but the production value, the way that it's actually put together, reaches a much broader audience. And you know, we know that most folks' attention span, especially in this time of COVID, is much shorter. To have a compact presentation of a liturgy of the word that is both engaging, insightful, and gives stuff for you to continue to do is simply an amazing adaptation that I suspect lives well beyond this time of COVID. That gives us a path forward as we try to figure out what the church's next normal is going to look like.
And there certainly are lessons that we're learning at this time liturgically that we wouldn't have had to even address before.
Yeah.
And, I think, Mary, you had leaned into the reality that we're able to reach people now in ways that we have not been able to in the past. Just because the sort of boundary line around our liturgies is more open to some degree, but it's perhaps bringing up for the church this idea that what liturgy is for is more than what we had thought, that it actually is an invitation to understand more expansively what liturgy is for and what the prayer book is for that matter, and how we can use it.
I had another, if I could continue that, as I was reflecting back when I was a rector at St. Margaret's in Miami Lakes, which was a very diverse and fabulous community, had a lot of young families, and also had a lot of people that either had not been to church since they were small children, or had not ever been to church. And I remember this one woman who came, she had been coming about 6 weeks, and she and her husband, she loved the community. It was great. She said, you know, I love those hymns that we sing, but I don't have any idea what they're talking about. And she was born in another country, and English was not her first language. And her you know, she needed formation, but she also needed not to be singing old English hymns, you know. And there was music, of course, was a conflict in our congregation for a while. And we had to choose: are these hymns, these particular hymns, more important to you than the mission of this congregation? Because that's what we're talking about here. And you have a person who actually wants to be formed in the faith and the tradition, and we make it hard for her. And this is a professional person, an educated person. And it's like choose. And it wasn't that our music became dumbed down, but language became more contemporary, for sure, in order to form people, to make Christians.
Deon, I know that you have both an interest and an expertise in liturgical language. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the importance of expansive language in liturgy.
Well, I think especially now during this time of fermentation, we have to pay attention to our language. Our language will reinforce some of the very things that we said that we are trying to eradicate. A very quick example, if you look at our Book of Common Prayer, light and white is always positive, and black and dark is always negative. And whether we like it or not, we end up reinforcing some of the same white supremacy ideals that folks are out on the street protesting against. And we know, I mean, as a church, we know quite well that God dwells both in light and darkness. You know, a couple of weeks ago, we had the story of Moses, and it continued, you know, if you're following tract 1, the story of Moses with God. But strangely enough, in the RCL, the next line that came after the Exodus reading that talked about, you know, and Moses encountered God in sheer darkness, never makes it to the RCL. And so our language about God will ultimately tell the story of what we value. And so a couple definitions. Expansive language speaks about expanding the language that we use for God. So for anybody who's afraid that we might be pitching out Father from the Creed or from the Lord's Prayer, that's not what expansive language is intended to do. It's intended that in the places that we can, that we expand the language. So there's so many names for God out there that to be limited just to calling God Father and He does God and does our liturgy a disservice. I mean, I love the image of when Jesus said, you know, God is like that mother hen wanting to gather us underneath her wings. So that's the expansive language. And inclusive language is language that refers to humanity. To make sure that in our language that we speak about humanity rather than mankind, for instance, that we're able to be inclusive of how different people are able to experience the community gathered for worship. And so our language, I mean, I would love to get a sign that says language matters, because language really, what we do in church and how we do it, and what we say about God will convey just as much as us standing out front with a sign.
It's an interesting, there's an interesting intersection between class and language in terms of, you know, who gets to control the language, who gets to say what the right language is in liturgy, and how do liturgists who are, you know, either creating liturgy out of whole cloth or adapting liturgy in the prayer book or using the prayer book liturgies, how do we check our own privilege or our own cultural preference for the sake, Mary, as you were saying, for the sake of the larger mission of the church? And at the same time, honoring the specific gifts that we have in leading liturgy, leading people in prayer. I'm wondering, yeah.
I was just going to, I think one of the things in the hospitality of God that Michael Parham and I both were so impressed with was that all these missional leaders, right, these folks who are on the fringe playing around with this stuff, were great liturgists, and they understood Anglicanism and and our theology really, really well. And I think it means we have to go deeper into what we say we believe and look for its essence, which is broad and inclusive and all love and grace. You know, it's all there. And so it is about just pulling back some things. You know, COVID has pulled back things we shouldn't have, and veils that we need removed from our eyes. And I think the church is equally should be open to that winnowing, you know, and to that work of the Spirit.
One of the questions that I've been asking, being bishop here for roughly 4 months, one of the questions I've been asking in quite a few of the virtual town halls that I've been doing is what do we need to let go of so that something new can grow here? And I really think that might be a question for the whole church. What are some of those things that we need to let go of so that something can grow here? Because it's comfortable to know, well, I'm going to show up on an Episcopal church, turn to 355, and I know someone's going to say those words that are familiar. And I wonder sometimes if we've become too comfortable in that expectation, whether we do need to figure out what are some of the things that we need to let go of, that God can do and grow something new with our church, or well, with God's church, I should say, as we enter this time. I mean, I really do see this time as our time of being planted in the ground during the pandemic to figure out what's going to grow out of it when it's all done. You know, we've been having these reports, like the one that just came out in 2019, talking about the imminent demise of the church if we don't have a radical shift. And I do wonder if this time of pandemic may not be our great awakening to say, here's where the seed needs to really take some root and grow.
Riffing on the prayer, liturgy is not for solace only. It's for something more. How do you both have different experiences as bishops, and I know that bishops have a particular concern about liturgy and a particular authority about liturgy. And I wonder if you could speak about the sort of collaborative process that you've experienced. You know, what is a bishop's role in collaboration in terms of liturgical revision or liturgical innovation?
Well, I suspect this might be the place where that whole spiritual communion thing might come in. I think I heard a bus go by.
Coming after you.
Or coming behind me.
Watch out. Jump off the road.
Exactly. I mean, as Episcopalians, as followers of Jesus, we are incarnational. We are intended, we incarnate stuff. We are made for sacred touch. And I mean, when you think of the Eucharist, and like Paul, where you are, that beautiful dining room that you're sitting in, all worship spaces for us are big dining rooms. And we get to incarnate, we get to remember, we get to put back together to be a part of that dining room where Jesus sat with the disciples. And so we have to be in some ways present. The bread and the wine aren't just spiritual things, they're physical things as well. You know, the body and blood of Christ are physical things as well. So, you know, taking something like spiritual communion, we can't do distance consecration because it requires us to be incarnate. The same way how we have to have at least one other person to consecrate the elements, to represent the community present. We actually need to have the physical elements present to be able to do that. And I think what bishops are tasked with, or at least my understanding is that bishops are tasked with finding ways to say yes, maybe to a question that has not been already answered or already asked. So like even in debate around virtual consecration and stuff like that, what I think that is at the heart of that is a longing for something that incarnates us again. We want to be physically able to touch and feel and be present. And it's ironic that this all began during Lent, that Lent was our season of fasting. And so I think what we're called to do is a little bit of fasting from what that incarnation might look like at this time. And bishops get to, I think, have the 30,000-foot view that, again, this pandemic will come to an end. There will be a time when we can gather back together, and when history looks back, this pandemic time will be a blip in the grand scheme of the life of the church.
As I sit inside the church building of St. Gregory of Nyssa here in San Francisco, we're in a fairly tightly closed down situation. And I look over at the chair over there, and there's a leaflet from Lent still sitting on the chair, which I have not removed yet. It's sort of place in a moment.
Yeah. I had a visitation yesterday where the Lenten hangings in the chapel were still, they were still there because no one's been in there since Lent.
Mary, what do you think about collaboration in terms of the bishop's role? And I don't know if your work with bishops in the college includes this kind of a question or not.
Yes, it has. Those are beautiful words, Deon. Thank you. I wrote down a few things. That "made for sacred touch" was a lovely poetic line. Yeah, so the reality is, in our constitution and canons, nobody imagined a COVID, right? A pandemic. So we do not have explicit provision for this. And because of our polity, there is no one person in the system that can say, do it this way, and that's okay. So we have had some conversations in the House, and the College for Bishops, which I'm the managing director, has sponsored some just voluntary conversations to study. They've been called "Setting a Table in the Wilderness." How do we incarnate the sacraments in this time, and do that in all the considerations that everybody in every diocese are considering about safety and also theology and so on. So we have talked about it. I think our bottom line question really has been, what is our missional future, and what do we learn? What can we learn now as we move forward into whatever the future holds for us? I don't know what normal is going to be. Deon's used the word normal a couple of times. I think we live in a time where that's a really fast-moving target, right? Whatever, we want this normal thing, but I'm not sure that's reality.
Well,
but
normal was
the next normal,
the hyphen there.
Yeah, like for 30 days, and then something else will happen, right? So, but
Yep.
I think one of the pieces in the conversation have another, also to Deon's point, is our prayer books flop open to 355, and we're assumptive that what worship and good liturgy means is that we have Eucharist in the way to which we have become accustomed. And, there's the incarnation of the Word, which is, for fans of the Gospel of John, it is just this business of deep sacred touch of the heart and the body and the soul and the mind. And so it is possible to have that in other ways. And I think this is an opportunity to be exploring those. And I think that's where the opening stuff comes in, that we're so nervous about stepping out of our assumed lines, and because we don't want any more conflict right now. And yet, could we be creative with the tensions? Could we create in our diocese, and I know it's happening, that communities of experimentation and exploration, and that's precisely what BO 68, the intention of it was to be in conversation about this. I know in El Camino, I'd said, if you're gonna, we'll adhere to the rubrics 98% of the time, and when you don't, let's talk and tell me what's going on. Why does this make sense to you in the community, and where are you pushing on this edge? I'm a horseback rider. I was just reading actually an Episcopal priest in Kentucky, Lori Brock. She wrote a book on riding and being Christian. And she says, if you're not feeling out of the control, at least part of the time while you're riding, you're not pushing yourself hard enough. And I think that's true for us as a church. It's like, let's get uncomfortable about this and, ride a bit of the edge, and we will find new things there, and we'll discover boundaries from which we should say we shouldn't go there, but we can't play in that realm of discovery if we aren't a bit brave.
Well, I think we also have an opportunity to look clearly at some of the things that we already are doing. Here in the Diocese of Missouri, one of the things that we did is we adapted the Maundy Thursday agape meal that could be used on Sundays at home. It's not lay precedence. It's not consecrated. I mean, it's very clear that that's not what it is. That it's not a, hey, go grab some brine, go grab some wine, go grab some bread, and do it yourself at home. But it is an agape meal, and it's centered around the lectionary, and it has a teaching component. But it gets to what we already have. We already have an agape liturgy that we use once a year for Maundy Thursday that's been adapted to be used that around a meal. And so it's also teaching at the same time. So I mean, something as simple as that, it gets to what I was talking a little bit about, the incarnational aspect and that hunger and that yearning that folks have for, that they're missing in not being incarnate in the buildings.
Yeah. One of my other ponderings about this is I, stretch into some new communities I haven't been in before, had time to, because I was busy being a diocesan. So I've got some disposable time on which is great, to meet some other, some people outside the water I swim in, But this idea that it used to be that the church was the one that really studied and contemplated mystery. But STEM does now, right? So science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, the physicists, they're looking at dark matter. Anybody who's in that world will tell you, well, we don't really understand dark matter, but we use it all the time to build things, and theologians used to say things like that, which is what the mystery of the incarnation, the mystery of the sacraments is that. And so to engage that conversation as well in terms of this opportunity around, and I'm not pitching an argument for virtual communion, but there is so much more that we cannot see and touch that is at work in terms of the energy of the universe,
Well, it really does take us to first principles when it comes to this period of time. What are the first principles of the Eucharist? What are the first principles of the offices? How do we know, to go back to the original question, what is liturgy for? What are the first principles behind the answer to that question, so that it's not just about consumer choice? And there's actually a question, speaking of consumer choice, there's actually a question, that was a little segue for you. A question from James Farwell. Do you have thoughts about how we accommodate to some of these contextual shifts? He says short attention spans, etc., without liturgy simply becoming a consumer exercise. I have to assume that a part of the context of that question is liturgy in this COVID tide. So how do we know the balance between resonating to consumer choice versus resonating to the call of God in the liturgy? That's a hard question.
Well, thank you, Professor Farwell, my former liturgy professor at General. I don't think I don't believe I'm actually answering this question. But I think it's a both and. I mean, the example that I gave was Imagine Church from the Diocese of Atlanta. And that short worship experience is kind of consumerism, but it also was paired with some ongoing formation that happened during the week. So it wasn't just the liturgy in a vacuum and then you're done. It offered some opportunity to engage deeper with scripture, to deeper with questions to guide you throughout the week. So it is both the consumer, so you consume it, and then there's the nourishment that comes with the formational piece that goes with it. I mean, and I think that that's liturgy at its best, that it's you're consuming both literally and figuratively in the Eucharist, and then it's nourishing our faith. So hopefully there is formation that's going on in addition to the consuming.
I was in conversation with a friend of mine who's been studying mindfulness and learning how to teach it. And she commented, she said, my students don't want to really hear all the theory behind it and all of the, essentially the theology behind it. They want to know how to do it. They want to practice it. And I think that in part, what is the liturgy for is also to consider for whom is the liturgy. And in this generation, there is a deep desire for practice. We have many, many people in our culture that grow up without ritual. They know something's going on, but there's no language for that. And So their need to practice it, to incarnate it in themselves is extremely strong, which is very different than the formal education of religion and theology and the roots of spirituality, which is that can come later, but to help them understand what they might study after they've had an experience of it. I guess I would want to say is we can call it consumerist, but to me, it's like, what is it that you actually need right now? You know, to be responsive to that need as the church and not worry so much that we get heard with all the wonderful things we have to say. And I mean, the education system is full of that. They say children to stop asking questions in school because the teachers are often so intent on teaching their content that they don't listen and they don't answer the students' questions. So are we as guilty of that as the church, especially a very literate and well-educated church, is that we're simply saying what we want to say instead of actually responding to the needs that are present in the world that they've stopped asking from us.
I have a great quote that says, if you don't like change, you're going to like being irrelevant even less. It's a good thing for us to remember in the church.
There's a question which is in conversation with that from somebody who's not named in the doc I'm looking at. The question is, how do we balance using expansive language, many images for God, for the need for liturgical familiarity and repetition? Also, how do we avoid making these changes from the top down, being liturgical experts who tell people what they ought to want from the liturgy? So balancing the tension between familiarity and innovation, repetition.
Well, I'm not sure if repetition is a requirement for liturgy. That's making an assumption that you have to do the exact same thing every time. I mean, we could get into some of those early church heresies about efficacy, and if you don't say the words right. I mean, I think I was reading a couple months ago about our Roman Catholic sisters and brothers that were having an issue about the deacon that baptized the priest used the word "we baptize you" rather than "I," and this caused a whole big brouhaha. Familiarity is good. It runs the risk of becoming comfortability. I think the way that language lands on our ear sometimes gives us a new way of hearing. There's something about hearing familiar words, but then there's also something about hearing words that cause us to think, or cause us to think of something in a different way. I mean, even like the images for God, we tend to think of God as, you know, that bearded guy up there doing his thing. But like I said, I use the image of God as a mother hen. If we have to live with that image for a little bit, it begins to expand our vision and our understanding of who God is. If we have to see God pictured in a different way in our language, it takes us a little bit out of the comfortable place and puts us into a place of really living into our theology that God is incarnate in each one of us, that we're made in the image and likeness of God.
So the prayer of the church, the language of the church of prayer is our school. It's where we learn. It's where we are formed.
I would agree with that. That, you know, our liturgy is formation. I mean, our liturgy is teaching. I mean, if you want, I mean, I'll give a quick example. I did a funeral for a teenager that committed suicide back in 2018. And most of the folks who came to his funeral from his school were not churched in any way, shape, or form. And so, you know, we're in this, we had to move it to the Catholic church nearby because it's the only space big enough to accommodate. But I had someone come up to me afterwards and said, "Oh my God, that was so cool. You know, the candles, the incense, you know, it was like something out of Harry Potter." And then, you know, she followed and said, but like, it was so good that someone was talking about God and we didn't hear all about Father all the time.
Mm.
So here's someone who has no connection to the church, but they know from cultural Christianity, as I like to call it, they know from cultural Christianity that God is always Father. And so because the language that we used enriching our worship for that funeral, the language was different. And so even for somebody who's unchurched, they understood. I mean, they didn't understand all the nuances and the theology of everything that was going on, but they understood from just being present that this was something different. And it was a teaching tool. That liturgy became a moment of teaching, but it's also a moment for them to engage and to step into a space of uncomfortability. I wonder how often that happens to folks who have been Episcopalian for all or most of their life. That you walk in and it really makes you think about our cultural Christianity versus Christianity at its core.
Mary, do you have a response?
No, I would second everything Deon said, but I think I wanted that idea about liturgy as formation and to help us to really take seriously what are we forming for a particular cultural expression of Christianity through our liturgy, or are we forming for Christians in whatever cultural expression people show up in?
Mm.
And can we do that? Can we actually make room for that? And can we even spend some time examining that? Most of it's very unexamined in our tradition and in the language we use. And we just don't think very deeply about it, I think. It gets in the prayer book and we say, well, that's done.
Yeah.
I would want to, if it were mine to offer an invitation, I would say, let's invite one another to actually let our liturgical life and our prayer life be dynamic enough that actually it challenges us to create a culture that allows a much greater diversity of cultures and across generations, across race and ethnicity and sexuality and gender. And can we make space where we actually will not own our language so tightly that we can't allow it to change, because then we won't be who we are. And that to me feels like a rather fragile faith. And
Yeah.
I think my experience of Anglicanism is that it's much more solid than that. And I think we can trust it to be there, even if we really, really allow the Spirit to open it up for us.
Yeah. I think it has to move us from mere welcome into hospitality. I mean, name a Christian community that doesn't say that they're welcoming. Even the most, closed off conservative community will say that they are welcoming. It's moving towards a place that our liturgy offers hospitality.
The question just came from Joshua Huber. I love this idea of liturgy as formation. How does that coincide with the liturgy as an act of worship? I guess that is the question of how do we interweave formation and worship?
Well, I would, sorry.
Oh, no,
Did you want to
Mary,
go?
I just said a lot. It's you.
Well, I was just they're not mutually exclusive. And if we're coming to worship God, I mean, when I go to church, I'm assuming God's going to do something with me. I'm not just there to say, praise you, God, and that's good. I have checked that off my list, and I don't need to actually hear you at all. And I don't think that's our hope, expectation, or what we communicate in our liturgy or worship. I think they are a dance, worship and formation. And we should go leave that building praising God and just completely starstruck by whatever wisdom we manage to take into our being by the Holy Spirit.
Well, I think we have a couple questions queued up in our Q&A pop-up.
Oh, I haven't, I'm not looking at it because I was told Sarah said she'd do it, but.
Well,
my elves working on it. But did you see one you want to respond to, Deon?
Well, there's one that the first one that came in. One of the things that's very interesting in German is that there is an easy German version for people who are linguistically or cognitively challenged. Also in church and liturgy, not suggesting this is an answer or the only answer. It is an interesting attempt. Could you imagine creating an easy language BCP?
Mhm. Could you?
I love the idea. I mean, I like for me, anything that allows deeper access to worship, to formation. So, and I know that the chat's going to light up about dumbing down. But in some cases, I think that we can dumb up so much that we lose focus on what the point of all of what we're doing. So yeah, I could see, when we've done this as a church throughout, our history. I mean, that's part of the thing that I think we always forget, that in the history of the church, we have done some creative and innovative things in the midst of some really trying and hard times. I mean, the Book of Common Prayer for the Armed Services is a perfect example. Back in World War I, they created that book from pieces of the Book of Common Prayer to be a simpler, shorter, more easily digested version that our military folks did not have the time for. Here, sit around for an hour on a battlefield reading morning prayer or doing the Eucharist. It's like that just wasn't going to happen. So there were some adaptations that allowed, and so I could see a shortened version or a scaled down version of the Book of Common Prayer as being accessible and helpful.
I'm looking at the questions that have come through the chat, the Q&A function. There's one that goes to the question of, people actually do come to church. The question is, in my community, mission and kingdom and the work of Jesus are matters for the spiritually experienced, whereas the majority of people visiting for the first time have come to find out, quote, who is God? How can liturgical formation and innovation accommodate both perspectives? I mean, we're not only talking about one kind of person who comes to worship with one set of needs or one set of strengths.
I'll go first this time. I think that we should never underestimate the power of community. And we're talking about liturgy as though it's the only thing that goes on in a church, and it isn't. So there are all these wonderful people across the orders of ministry of lay, deacon, priest, and bishop who intermingle and intersect and have networks. And one might answer the question well about who is God, and the other might say, why don't you come on Tuesday and make some sandwiches for the poor people that live outside our door? And, I mean, there's a multitude of ways that the networking of the Holy Spirit will do the work of formation. Well, plenty of it outside of liturgy, to the point where those conversations become liturgical. They become moments of sacred touch that are outside the formal expression of the church. And so I just think we ought to make sure that, I suppose for me, that church life is thinking of it as liturgical, that it's got form and shape, and we don't always see it at work, but it's happening. And that can hold all the questions.
I think we enter the liturgy needing, wanting, or expecting different things. On one given Sunday, you need solace. And on the other Sunday or, other worship service, you need strength, to quote Percy. So, I mean, and liturgy is, as Mary said, is not the only place that, I mean, the church is not boiled down to just its liturgy. But in a sense, we enter these spaces needing, wanting, seeking different things. You know, when you're in person on a given Sunday, a person who's never been to church walks into the door right next to someone who's been in this church for 20 years. They're going to experience the exact same liturgy and take two completely different experiences back out the door.
There's a string of related questions about the role of the laity well, let me ask it. I'm sorry, read. Sarah McDonald asks, what role does the laity play in collaboration with liturgy? And the question beneath that is, how can we democratize our liturgy in a way that empowers more ownership of our liturgy for individuals without collars?
Can we hear, well, it's not possible, I suppose, to hear a bit more about that. But there's way more lay people at any given liturgy than there are ordained.
Yeah.
You know, I think that's a perspective, and certainly clericalism is something that our church undergirds, and it's a cultural thing in a way that we participate in either knowingly or unknowingly. And I'm sorry for that. I talk about there are 4 orders of ministry because we are all ordered for ministry at baptism, and I'm sure I'll get some nasty grams about that, but that's what I think. And I know in my life that when that felt very freeing for lay people. It's like there is no difference in the quality of the ministry that we offer. It's just a different location, and the location of the laity is far more widespread than that of the clergy. Because we are slotted into particular places, which is important, but it's not more important. And the access of laity is far greater, oftentimes, certainly in any community, it's far greater than that of the access of the priest, and most definitely of the access of the bishop, who has the most limited amount in the many communities that a bishop will have to serve in a geographic region. So I think it's partially how do we, again, to the power of language, which Deon can speak more about, but you know, how do we democratize our language and our culture and our behavior to actually reflect what we say we believe in our baptismal covenant?
Well, and to piggyback off of that, there are lots of places in the liturgy that where folks in crafting that can come, the laity comes in. I mean, I would agree with you about the 4 orders of ministry. I mean, baptism is Christian initiation. One of the things that I did when I was in a parish was I made sure that our baptismal certificates were almost the same size as my ordination certificate, to say that baptism is important. And liturgically, I mean, again, we do this all the time. We teach that baptism is not as important, even though we say that it is. So for instance, I mean, I've been into way too many churches that on a Sunday morning, the font is either pushed off to the side and empty, and only brought out when there's time for baptism. Now, think about the symbolism and the message that tells us about baptism, and yet we will say that baptism has the same and equal place with Eucharist, but it often doesn't get the same and equal prominence. We'll empty the font. Well, now they're all empty because of COVID, but during regular time, we'll have the font empty and pushed off to the side somewhere, and we move it around for when we have baptism. We generally don't think about the space for it. The parish that I came from, I got one of the rare opportunities to help design a new space. And so we built a font that you could walk into. I mean, it is massive. And it's the same materials around the font made the altar, so that you connected Eucharist and baptism together. And when you got into that font, you got wet. I mean, we poured lots of water on you and you were soaking wet. Because our theology, our Book of Common Prayer says the preferred method of baptism is immersion, not sprinkling, it's getting soaking wet. And so our liturgy will tell the story for us, whether we like it or not. And so, like, using baptism as an example, either we say that baptism is, you know, Christian initiation and the foundation of all ministry, we also have to make our symbols and our liturgy reflect that as well. We can't just, it can't be do as I say, not as I do.
Mhm. There's a question from Jody Howard. But I think this relates to the question of democratizing the liturgy. There was recently a wide-ranging discussion on social media about the complexity of the daily office. I wonder, as we rightly expand our images and language, how do we avoid making things so complex that specialists are required even for services that were intended to be unmediated and accessible? You're laughing.
One of my friends had a great quote that said, "A steady diet of the of morning prayer is deadly." um, but I mean, I think again it gets back to language. We somehow think it has to be an either it's this or that. It's not a binary choice. It's both and. The daily office and I have a tepid at best relationship. I just cannot do morning prayer, and I are just kind of like, okay, here we go. That's just not my spirituality. I found, for instance, like daily prayer for all seasons has both a complex version of a morning and evening prayer and a very simple version that you can use. And I think that that's where we're called in the church to be. You know, there is not a one size fits all. The common prayer part doesn't mean that we say the common prayer. It means that the structure is what holds us in common.
And it's, you know, I think we have to recognize that the office liturgies and the prayer book are really, although predominantly done privately, are sort of imagined as communal actions. I mean, you pray together, and when you pray together, you have more opportunities to expand your repertoire as a worshiper through song and through chant and through silence and through beauty and through liturgical gear like incense and all of these things. So there's a way in which, you know, some of the complexity of the offices might just be that they weren't initially imagined as private offices. It's something to be done in common.
I'd also add to that we, first of all, they were designed in a very different time and with very different sorts of literacies in mind. And all people don't work in a 24-hour rhythm. And so people's spiritual disciplines may not get practiced at the same 30 minutes every day. For whatever reason. And I think it's important to honor not only our work realities, our daily life realities, but the way people's spiritual and body rhythms work. And that's okay. And that if actually to lay on people that if you don't do the daily office every day, you know, there's going to be dire consequences to your spiritual health is to actually distract them with a lot of guilt that is inappropriate and I pray is unintentional. And then say, so how does your spiritual rhythm work? You know, how could we help you have a thriving prayer and study life that works with your being instead of against it? You know, that is a gift that will develop and nurture and form and create a person that will be praising God and taking in God's love and nurture, you know, throughout the day instead of working against their own way of functioning.
Yeah, I mean, it gets into a bit of that classism that we were talking about earlier. To be able to get up in the morning and dedicate 35 an hour to do morning prayer is a luxury of, you know, of middle upper class. If you were part of the working poor, if you are an immigrant family, you don't have the luxury of doing that.
If you have small children, you don't have the luxury
I
of
have
doing
a
that. You have
9-year-old.
to get in your car at 6 a.m. and commute to work. You don't have the luxury, you know.
Exactly.
That's your home reality. Yeah.
I mean, I have a 9-year-old and just one in the house right now, and the morning is a struggle, and he's just walking downstairs.
Yeah. I think too, I'll just add, I have a set of gospels that don't have any chapters or verse citations. And the things that I get out of that, because they get cut out of our lectionaries in our offices, that I've just, I'll just stick with the one verse because I haven't spent much time with it in my life. And it's like, wow, that is a powerful verse. And we just cut out the verse that came before the parable because we were more interested in the teaching of the parable. It's like, yeah, but this verse before it sets up the parable so beautifully, and it's perfect, and it's so important, So I think we could expand that repertoire in a way that would really help people practice formation in their faith lives.
Yeah. I mean, someone mentioned in the chat about, well, you could just grab a podcast and listen to it while you're driving or something like that. But again, it assumes that you're driving. It assumes that you are able to have that luxury of a podcast. I mean, part of the challenge for the church, I think, is that we have to get out of the mindset that everybody is the same. Our worshiping communities are not the same. They cannot be. Predominantly Spanish-speaking congregation. We're in the process of figuring out planting a couple here, and we know, Sunday morning is just not going to work. I could say a whole lot more about that, but
but it goes to the original question: what is liturgy for? Is liturgy about obedience to rules primarily, or is it about transformation of life? And how are our lives transformed in worship? How do we experience transformation in the community of the church when we gather for prayer? Which strikes me as perhaps a more profound area of wondering. Somebody's thinking about saying something.
Oh,
I was agreeing with you.
Yeah, same. I think too that it is, who are we doing this for? As we think about prayer book revision, and who is this for? Is it just for us? Because that's just, to me, is not a worthy exercise. It's not missional. If we're just doing it we're missionized. We got it. We're in. Yeah. Yeah. So.
Well, I'll ask you the question: who is prayer book revision for?
I'm not in your group, so I don't know how you're thinking. But I mean,
I see a bus coming.
They can hit me. I'm good. I'll take it for you. Well, I would hope that we'd be listening to the places in our church that are connected with all kinds of diverse communities, that we speak a foreign language, and can we learn some new languages and actually converse and be able to listen and then speak? Can we create liturgy? Can it be for them, for those who are not here and that want to be, that are hungry, that want faith, that hope it's true? I had someone say to me the other day, I said, so tell me about what you think about God. And this person said, I really, really hope it's true. And he'd not had any experience in the church or any experience of faith formation, wasn't raised in a family that did that. But in deep yearning, I think it's the first time he'd ever said it to anyone. I really want it to be true. It's like, what if it were true?
It strikes me as an amazingly faithful stance.
It's beautiful. It's just beautiful. Now, could he recite the Nicene Creed or say the Lord's Prayer? No. Does he want to? Maybe. But is that going to place to start? Probably not. In terms of the formation piece, so are there liturgies for folks like that? Because there's a lot of folks out there like that. That's my experience, is that lots of people actually dapple with this stuff in their heads. But they don't have places, or we do not in the Episcopal Church provide places for honest, vulnerable conversation. that's got ritual with it, you know, because a little bit of ritual goes a long way. And for folks like that, they don't need very much. And I don't call that dumbing down. I call it actually speaking to the one who needs to hear.
Liturgical hospitality.
Liturgical hospitality. Mm-hmm.
So what is the work that we need to do in understanding and articulating our liturgical theology? What is the work that we need to do to say to that brother who hopes that God is real, so that we can share the faith in our worship?
I think we stop pretending. I think we stop pretending that we have all the answers and that we have it all together. I think the biggest disservice that we give to folks outside of the church is the perception that we have the answers and we know exactly how this all works. And perhaps that might be the learning from this pandemic, that we are just as messed up as everybody else, that we have those same questions, that we can stop pretending that it's like, you know, on Sunday morning when we get dressed up to go into church or something like that, that somehow we're walking back out acting as if we are better or if we have a closer connection to God because we've recited the prayer book, the Nicene Creed and read the Lord's Prayer. We are still as messed up and as vulnerable and in need of that divine love as anybody else. And so, you know, it's easy to get sometimes on our liturgical high horses that if you're not doing it this way or that way, that it's not quite right. Ultimately, we are all searching for that deep, profound connection to the divine. And it's time, as I said, it's time that we stop pretending we have all the answers and perhaps stand in that place of questioning, in that cloud of unknowing, and ultimately that's where we all are.
I'm mindful as you say that, Deon, of your language about sacred touch. And there's good touch and there's bad touch, and there's gentle touch, and there's familiar touch. There's touch that touches the parasympathetic systems within us. Just it's the lightest of touch, right? But it actually releases stress and it releases energy in ways that can be very healing in the body. And you know, if we think about that in terms of what kind of touch does this liturgy, what is it intended to, what kind of touch is it intended to use and for whom? And is this the appropriate touch for this person and for where they are in their lives? You know, to initiate with prayer D is a pretty heavy touch, right? It is for people who are used to being bathed in that language and to being touched with that language. It is not for the person for whom, you know, the word God that's enough touch, right? It's just a word. It's a single syllable word that has not a complete understood meaning, you know. That's enough touch for that person. So how do we create repertoire of that, of pressures and types of touch, and how can we be conscious of the impact of the way those touches are experienced? And we've done plenty of work around that in terms of sexual misconduct, but there's great metaphor in that, actually.
Yeah.
To think about liturgy in that same sort of way.
As we come closer to the end of our time together, we have about 10 minutes left. I'm wondering what is the question that that has not been asked that you're ready to answer?
Mary, I think this is your bus coming.
I just would find it, let's see, are we sufficiently grieved as we look at that report last week about that there won't be anybody in our pews in 30 years? Are we sufficiently grieved by that story to continue to hold on to something that's not speaking, that's not heard? Are we sufficiently willing to let go of the spaces that may be speaking things that are not heard anymore or can't be heard. Because how many people go to church on Sunday may not be the way we should count. I mean, there's all kinds of questions in this, but are we not alarmed? Are we not lamenting? Can we be at a point of enough to say we're willing to actually release some things? That would be my question. How willing are we to really step into some unknown spaces to live this mission that God is calling us to live? I believe that we are being called to live this. And I think we have tremendous gifts in the Episcopal Church, and it would be an unbelievable loss of our core identity. Not our culture. Some of our culture just needs to go. But it would be a loss of Anglican ethos because we have some gifts that other churches do not have. So that was partially question and sermon. So I apologize.
Wow. Can I follow up on that sermon?
Yeah, go right ahead.
Well, my fear, especially with this current report, is that we will spend time forming committees and talking about it and not doing anything about it. That we'll rearrange the deck chairs as the ship is beginning to go down. That is my fear. My hope is that during this time of fermentation, that we actually emerge energized about where God is calling the church to be. Phyllis Tickle had her book, The Great Emergence, was saying that it takes a massive disruption sometimes to jolt the church back into its place. And so I honestly think that this pandemic time might be our great emergence, that I'm a student of history as well. And so looking back at history, after every major disruption, this amazing set of creativity comes bursting out. If you look at Europe, the Renaissance came after the plague. In Harlem, the Harlem Renaissance came after a time of civil and social unrest. You look at any major disruption, and it's usually the place where the creativity comes from. And I am hopeful, just looking at what's happening during this pandemic time, that if we can keep that energy and that creativity going, that that report will be our wake-up call.
Thank you. I'm going to ask you one last question, which is, it's not an easy one to answer.
The others have been?
Your bus. I'm sure it's your bus.
Any ideas on how to create all this change when many clergy are part-time, have been working full-time during the pandemic, have no hope of sabbaticals, and little support from their congregations to go out into the community or to address racism and white privilege?
I'll go first. I'll take the bus. Well, eat an elephant one bite at a time.
Yep.
And I think it's as I listen to that list, it's really important not to segregate those things, physically and metaphorically. They are, if liturgy and mission go together, then they go together. I would also suggest that to ask more questions than you provide answers for. The answers are in the questions. And when we engage a lot of questions that are open and that spark our imagination, we get more energy. So you'll be energized by that work. It's not easy work, but it is also not grueling work. It is creative and artistic work. We talk about ourselves as liturgists, as practitioners, our job titles and our vocational identities, but might we think about ourselves as artists of the faith and ones who create? I mean, look at that beautiful mural behind you at St. Gregory of Nyssa. It's beautiful. And we in our Anglican tradition, art is part of our history, our tradition. It's part of our formation. And I would just want to encourage us to find the artist within and start painting and drawing, and the pots that don't work, toss them against the wall and start again. This is a wonderful freeing time if we allow it to be.
Thank you, Mary.
The only thing I could add to that is amen.
Bring on the bus.
Next bus, come on.
No.
I just want to thank you both so much for your time. I know that it's a busy time, and I know that there are lots of needs that need to be filled. And so I do appreciate your sharing your time with us, sharing your experience and your wisdom and your insight. And I want to let you know that there's a fly that's about to land on my head. And Mike,
Did Ruth Ginsburg, Bader Ginsburg send it?
Should we start the memes now?
Yeah. But thank you. I want to say thank you for the invitation. I was very honored because I don't consider myself in this particular circle that's gathering. So I feel very blessed by that, and I'm grateful. Thank you.
I'll echo Mary's. Thank you so very much for the opportunity to be a part of the ongoing conversation. I suspect that there was much that we didn't cover, but if nothing else, I hope that we have at least spurred some of the questions that we should be asking and wrestling with as a church.
I also want to let our participants know that questions that have been submitted, we will try and roll into other sessions, other seminars. The next plenary is scheduled to begin at 4:30 p.m. Eastern time. I believe that's correct. And I think that, Sarah, you want to give some instruction on logging back in and all that?
It is the same link, so making it really easy. I also just posted in an evaluation as well about this session and together. So it is at 4 p.m. Eastern time.
4 p.m. Yes, Kim Hardy in Vermont.
Say 4 p.m. Eastern. You heard it here. At least that's when Paul and I are going to show up. So hopefully we won't be by ourselves. And again, if you could give us your brief thoughts on the evaluation, that will be helpful. And hopefully the recordings from today will be in your inboxes by tomorrow morning.
Also want to let you all know that the recordings of these sessions will be available. We're working on getting those posted, and we'll have more information about that after the next session. All right, everybody, thank you. Enjoy your break, and we will see you back here at 4 p.m. Eastern time.
You need us for anything more, or that's okay?
We're done.
I'm going to go ahead and shut it off.
Okay,
Bye-bye.
thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.